All right, let's get this party started. Uh, Welcome to the September installment of the Appgate ZTNA Table Talks. I'm your MC and host today, Jim Anthony. And with me, I have a couple of esteemed guests, Miss Arlette Hart, who runs our I'll let Arlette and Jason introduce themselves. Why don't take it away, Arlette? Introduce yourself real quick, and then I'll come back and explain what we're going to do today.
Okay, thank you. Hello, my name's Arlette Hart. I run our threat advisory services, which is our penetration testing and malware analysis capabilities here at Appgate. We have some high-end penetration testing people who really just know their business and um, have been defining how people can take advantage of zero trust network access and the SDP product, but also providing just services to the rest of our team or to the rest of our clients. I come from Leidos before here, where I was in the chief technology officer space. And before that, I was chief information security officer for the FBI. So I am very thrilled to be here. And I came to Appgate because I think this product is an amazing product. And some of the things that we're going to be discussing here today are part of why it's an amazing product.
Awesome, thank you, Arlette. Mr. Garbus.
All right, thank you, Jim. So I'm Jason Garbus. I lead the product management team here at Appgate. And outside of Appgate, I have a leadership role with the Cloud Security Alliance, where I am a co-chair of the Zero Trust Working Group. And in that role, I have the opportunity to lead research, but also spend a lot of time talking to both practitioners and enterprise folks about how they're approaching zero trust. And this really dovetails very well together with the topic today around universal ZTNA. So I'm excited to be diving in.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Garbus. So again, like I said, this is our September installment of the Appgate ZTNA Table Talks. Um, Please, first of all, thank you for joining us. Thank you for carving an hour out. Hopefully, this is an informative hour. I don't know that we're going to go the full hour, but we'll see. We'll see what comes of it. It's going to be a very wide open conversation. Today, Arlette and Jason are going to help us talk about simplifying security challenges with a universal ZTNA solution. We're going to talk about how ZTNA impacts complex networks, how ZTNA can be used to augment or replace unsecured VPNs and other outdated systems. And we'll dig deep into some of the evolving attack methods that we're seeing out there in the market. As a reminder, if you've got questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A panel or the chat for the Zoom webinar. And without further ado, let's jump into the first concept. So let's set the table a little bit. Mr. Garbus, with your background, why don't you give us a quick explanation? What is ZTNA?
So zero trust network access, or ZTNA, is the way that you achieve, I would say, the actual enforcement of zero trust policy. So if we put this in the context of zero trust is a security strategy and a mindset that says, okay, we need to shift away from traditional perimeter-based and siloed security models and enforcement points to things that are identity-centric and workload or resource-centric. And if you think about the pillars of the CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model, you've got identity and devices and networks, applications and workloads and data. And what ZTNA really does is the glue that goes across those. And a ZTNA system lets you define an access policy that says these identities using these devices on these networks are permitted to access these applications and workloads and data under these circumstances. And you can't do any of that without zero trust network access, because that's literally the piece that sits in between and is the enforcement mechanism and what allows these identities on these devices to access workloads and data. So ZTNA is kind of where the rubber meets the road here in terms of actually defining and enforcing zero trust policies.
Interesting stuff. So from a technology perspective, are there different types of ZTNA solutions in the market?
Yeah, there really are. And I don't know how much time you got, right? But there's lots of different architectures around that. And I'm sure we'll end up talking about some of those Architectures all have advantages and disadvantages, but our perspective here at Appgate is that you want something that is holistic as possible and lets you define in one place the access policy that works, regardless of who the user is, where they are, or what they're accessing.
Interesting. All right. So let's dig a little deeper. So as we look at ZTNA and we understand a little bit about what it actually is, help us understand more about why it matters. Arlette, maybe you could jump in on this topic.
Yeah, actually, I would love to jump in on this topic because the reason ZTNA matters is because it gives you um, almost an upside down view of the historic way that you would look at data. So it, by definition, marries your person to your device, to your network, to your application, so that you really can see who it is who is accessing your critical assets at a different point in time. When you look historically across how people used to, or the legacy ways of building your applications, you would have a person, and then you would have the network, and then you would have the device, and then you would have the application and the, those kind of, and they would all be sort of in their own little silo. So you'd have your identity management, but then it took a ton of work to take your identity to your application. And then when you were looking at it from a security perspective, like in your SIM, and saying, okay, I got to marry all these pieces together, and it was extremely complex, especially if somebody had like multiple identities. I'm a developer and I'm a user and I'm a system administrator. So what role were you at what point in time? But with zero trust network access, that becomes entirely simplified, and it really just makes that whole story a straightforward story. So you can see exactly who is doing what at what point in time. I'm a security person from my background. I'm not the network access person. I know network is part of security, but it's also got a lot of other components to it. But when you can actually see who is accessing what and what the risk is of that person accessing that information, it makes a huge difference. You're not just wondering, oh, I wonder if that's a decent connection to have been made. You have that connection. You know exactly who's doing what. And that's what's really important about the zero trust network access story.
Yeah, and
So
so and specifically what you're doing is you can actually now view this stuff from an identity centric perspective and not an IP address centric. So as Arlette was mentioning, you move away from this world of, okay, IP address, 10.5.3.7 is accessing IP address 192.168.3.7. Well, what does that mean, right? How do you disambiguate these IP addresses, especially when you got people who are on-prem, people who are remote, people who go through network address translation gateways? It becomes extremely difficult for someone in the SOC or for tools to give you a real picture versus what Zero Trust gives you, what ZTNA gives you is a very clear picture says, oh, this is Sally and she's on a corporate managed device, and Sally is the CFO, and she's accessing this resource here or that resource there. That is 100 times better and more meaningful, and it makes it much, much more effective to see what's going on, to diagnose anomalies, and to respond as necessary.
The
so
cleanness
is
of
it
the,
I'm sorry,
I'm
go ahead,
sorry.
Arlette.
Now, the cleanness of it is one of the biggest pieces, because when you are trying to marry all these pieces without having a direct access where you can't trace from one point to the next point, you have a whole lot of noise that's going on also. But when you have the zero trust piece of it, it cleans up all of the access pieces and you can see exactly who is doing what. And if there's extraneous noise, you can look at that and say, oh, that's something I shouldn't be seeing. Let me go look at that instead of spending all your time looking at legitimate traffic or even trying to make sure that it's legitimate traffic.
So is it fair to say that all other network access technologies and tools and capabilities that existed before ZTNA suddenly became legacy since the advent of ZTNA? Would that be a fair statement?
Um, well, they predated it, so I guess by definition it makes them legacy. Are you
All
asking
right.
if they're obsolete
Sorry,
or
didn't mean to throw a
legacy?
zinger out there. All right, so let's keep going on this. So all right, you've convinced me, right? So ZTNA, it does matter. It's an interesting way to actually tie a bunch of different things together to control access to things. If I bought off on a ZTNA solution, what should I expect in a deployment? What are some of the things that I would need to deploy? How would it look in my environment? What would I need to know about that environment in doing that deployment in a proper way? Give me some information about this.
So I'll jump in. So we talked about upfront this notion of universal ZTNA, which is all users, all devices, and all access to all resources. And that is a fantastic destination. It's not necessarily a starting point. So what you should think about is kind of how do you want to get there and what do you want to start with? Do you want to start with just remote users? Do you want to start with just on-prem users? Do you want to start with controlling access to just some cloud-based resources or just your high-value assets? There's no wrong answer to any of those questions, but the right thing to do is to think about it carefully and decide, okay, where do I want to get started? Do I want to roll this out to everyone? Do I want to roll it out to a very small number of people so I learn? Do I want to start with, certain environments? And how does that tie to other things my business is doing, like we're migrating things from our data center to the cloud, or we're adopting DevOps, or we're went through an acquisition and we have to onboard this other company. So the things that you should expect is number one, you're going to have all of a sudden a really powerful set of policies and capabilities to enforce that. And you want to do that thoughtfully and incrementally so that you can get some experience with it and you can show value to the business quickly.
I
So,
think one of the other pieces, so when you think in terms of all people, all networks, all devices, some of the things that you can also think about are where are they physically coming from? So those are places that you can identify what you're having a risk perspective, just to Jason's point of view or comments, is if you have a risk perspective on should I be allowing people from this particular location to be able to access my infrastructure, that gets to be an interesting story to tell. And if you are particular about it, or should I let them go anywhere they want at any time, or should I limit where they're going to and from and things like that? Because it does make a difference, like who can access your information, what the networks are that they're going over, how those kind of pieces are also being controlled. It makes a difference.
awesome. So, Jason, listening to you describe some of the choices that you need to make up front, deciding which groups, which data centers, which applications you want to provide protected access to initially, it sounds to me like you've got some flexibility in how you actually deploy a ZTNA solution. How does that manifest itself in reality? Is there a subset of technology that you would deploy initially, or is there some sort of integration or overlay concept that would apply here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that the AppGate SDP technology works is it does operate as a network overlay, which is great because it allows you to deploy this incrementally. It acts as a simplifying layer across what is typically a very complex and very heterogeneous enterprise environment. And the way things work, our customers will deploy enforcement points, what we call gateways, in their environments, and those act as the entry point to the network and the enforcement point for the policies and the termination point for a secure tunnel from the user's device. Customers also get complete control over how the network traffic is routed. So unlike other vendor solutions that force network traffic to get routed through the vendor cloud, in our world, in our view, that traffic is directly routed from a user's device to this enforcement point that runs in the enterprise infrastructure. So there's no hairpinning, there's no additional latency, and that traffic never leaves environments where enterprises don't want it. What we do also offer is the ability to host the control plane or the brain of the system in our security cloud, so that customers don't have to host that component, and we take responsibility for managing it. And there's also a set of cloud-based services that enhance that. So the things that you would need to think about is, do I want to self-host it or do I want the decision point to be hosted up in the AppGate cloud? And then where do these enforcement points get deployed? And how are users going to be utilizing them? Are they going to do it when they're in the office or only remote or both?
So let's dig in on those enforcement points a little bit. You mentioned the word gateway. It sounds like these are devices on the edge of a network controlling access. Are they physical? Are they virtual? What kind of things exist there?
Yeah, so they're virtual. I would say a very small minority of customers deploy them onto dedicated hardware. The vast majority deploy them as virtual machines on their infrastructure, whether it's on-prem or in a cloud-based environment. Those gateways, sit so they are globally accessible by authorized users. They are protected through a simple but effective form of cryptography, so that all unauthorized actors don't see them, they can't attack it. And this is, that one little piece by itself is a huge improvement over traditional VPNs, which advertise themselves to every malicious actor on the planet saying, hey, I'm a VPN from vendor X, please attack me, try to log in. Our gateways are designed from the ground up to be secure and to be hidden on the network through this form of cryptography.
Interesting. So what kind of mechanism is actually used to control the end user's traffic to these appliances that are sitting on the edge of the network?
So the part of the whole concept of universal ZTNA has really made its way into the philosophy of our platform and our product. And we embrace a very wide variety, I would say the broadest variety of user experience or user devices. Now, having said that, for enterprise customers, the majority of users will have the AppGate SDP client installed on their device. And the reason for that is you then get a very secure mutual TLS tunnel from your device to those gateways. So that's secure. You also have the ability to do deeper device introspection, device posture checks, and interaction with the user on that device. So that's typically what customers deploy. There are options for a clientless portal or what we call a light client, where you wouldn't require elevated permissions to install that, as well as network-based no client, or I should say clientless access options as well. There's a lot of flexibility. The core sweet spot is deploying the client on the user device because you get maximum security and maximum control.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Yeah, I think from an end user perspective, of course, it's pretty transparent. Many customers choose to have this run in an always on mode where the user logs into their desktop, the AppGate client runs, it connects, and they just do their job. Other ones, the users would launch the client, but it will interact or federate with their enterprise identity provider. So there's typically seamless single sign-on, ties into their enterprise multi-factor. So it's a very smooth user experience, and users get a little launch pad with icons, or they can go directly to resources as they're used to.
So on a lot of networks, I know that there's more than just user traffic out there. What would a ZTNA solution do to provide controlled access for other types of network traffic, like I don't know, IoT devices, webcams, printers, things like that? Does that come into play?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're touching on the fun parts of universal ZTNA, where the mission of what we created really embraces and leans into this universal aspects of universal ZTNA. And the AppGate SDP infrastructure and platform can support obviously user to service traffic. It can support server to user traffic as well as server to server, and different types of protocols or devices on the network, maybe IoT devices, printers, cameras, anything that is on the network, and a TCP network can be secured, even if there's no ability to install a client on it. So there's lots of ways that customers have deployed this to use network-based enforcement to segment and control access.
Perfect. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. So now I understand more about ZTNA, what it's doing in the market, what to expect in a deployment. Um, what sort of business value should I expect once I go through this process? How is my IT budget going to be impacted? My cybersecurity budget? Is there some ROI that could be calculated? What are some of the things that will drive business value out of thinking about a ZTNA deployment within an environment?
Arlette, you want to chime in?
Sure, sure. So one of the things that can especially be driving business value for ZTNA is you can lower your total cost of ownership for your network infrastructure um, dramatically, because you don't have to lease your entire infrastructure, your networks, in the same way that you had to before. You also have a lot more simplicity. So a lot of the complexity in the security side has been, as I mentioned, tying the pieces together and like building up the stories for how you actually tie point A to B to C to D. And this one ties it together for you. So you have a lot less development effort in your in the integration side of your security story. So your SIM actually has all the information that it already needs. You also have a lot of value just eliminating a ton of your access questions. Um, the the total number of people that are required to manage this thing is much, much lower because you don't have multiple people in the network side of the world. Your firewalls are easier to manage. Your complexity goes down dramatically, and the complexity piece of it is huge. One piece that I would say is you're going to end up with a lot of changes no matter what, but adding a ZTNA component means those changes are actually manageable instead. So you can, when you do mergers and acquisitions, you don't have to re-IP your entire infrastructure when you have SDP here. You can put the pieces together and you can have them all work without having to do like Herculean efforts of merging pieces together. You can use multiple identity providers while you're getting your infrastructure integrated and things like that. So it's just a lot easier and much more, much smoother transitions. Adding people, adding entitlements, those things just get a lot easier. And every time something is easier, you need many fewer people to do it. So I've worked identity sides of the world, and when you're driving an identity solution and you can actually tie it to entitlements and do it easily and smoothly, the world gets a lot easier and your cost of ownership is much, much lower.
Interesting. How would a ZTNA deployment have an impact on a GRC scenario or a cyber risk or a compliance requirement within a business? How is ZTNA going to have an impact there?
It's going to answer a lot of your compliance questions. It enables you to check a lot of boxes that you would have had that you have to check anyway. But from an operational perspective, a lot of it is, can you manage your assets? Do you understand who's doing what, where, and when? Do you have your identity management piece of it? And as you're checking the boxes, the ZTNA side of it just simplifies, again, the whole, okay, that checks 14 of the boxes as opposed to 3 of the boxes, which, a lot of the products, you can do a product suite a lot of times to do them, but you're still looking at individual capabilities. But ZTNA just checks a lot of the compliance boxes much, much more easily.
Yeah, I think a
Okay.
lot of the when we see enterprise customers doing this, what they experience is that it significantly reduces compliance reporting effort. Because they've got, number one, policies that will automatically adapt to identity attributes, for example, and they also provide essentially a compliance audit or compliance log that is in many ways self-documenting, so that we've seen customers really reduce the amount of manual effort or consolidation that they have to do periodically to report on compliance. And it's simply, okay, we know that we're all set. Let's run a report, or we can point the auditor to a log into a report, versus having to assemble the nightmarish group of spreadsheets every quarter.
Yes, nightmarish is the right word. All right. Well, that's a good conversation. So we've kind of danced around the whole idea of ZTNA from a generic perspective. I think we touched a little bit on AppGate's ZTNA solution. Let's dig deep on this. Jason, you mentioned earlier a couple of different components of the AppGate ZTNA solution itself. Give us a few differentiators that we can pick on.
So we've really seen enterprise customers, when they evaluate the AppGate solution against competitors in the marketplace, is they pick up and make their decisions based on a few things. So first of all, we really lean into this notion of universal ZTNA, and that's built in from day one, is the support for all network protocols, all directions, and all types. So it's not just securing user access to web apps from browsers. It's any TCP or UDP or ICMP network traffic, any direction, whether it's server initiated, like a VoIP call, or client initiated, or if it's server to server. Likewise, the very broad set of client experience, users on standard laptops, mobile devices, clientless, those types of things, even branch offices through some sort of connector technology that we have. That really allows customers to say, okay, I'm going to start with this one use case, but I'm not going to paint myself into a corner with a solution that only works for web access, or doesn't work for server initiated traffic, or isn't going to work for my sysadmins. So we see customers, no matter where they start, have the freedom and the ability to really grow and expand to achieve universal ZTNA. And what that, operationally, what does that really mean? It means you've got one control point, one place where you're defining access policies that works the same, whether the user's in the office in the morning, plugged into a docking station, and then after lunch, they pop out their laptop and they go to a coffee shop. Under normal traditional security models, they're moving from one security and hardware stack to another one that's completely different and completely isolated, and that introduces added complexity and gaps and risk. And what Universal ZTNA does through AppGate's implementation is it makes it really simple. So you have one control point, one place where you're reporting on things, and one place where you're defining policy. So that's one piece of it. I think the other piece is really the policy model that's built in is very dynamic and very flexible and has the ability to really easily integrate with not just identity solutions, but workload metadata and business processes like service desks to really tie into and achieve the potential for this kind of dynamic and contextual set of zero trust access policies.
Interesting. Arlette mentioned something in the previous slide about optimizing network costs. How does AppGate's ZTNA solution have an impact there? Can you dig into some of those details?
Yeah, sure, sure. So remember we talked about the control of routing and what the AppGate STP solution allows enterprises to do is to decide where and how network traffic gets routed. And in particular, in today's world where you have distributed users and distributed resources, there's no reason to fall back on traditional enterprise backbones, wide area networks utilizing, in some cases, very, very expensive networking solutions like MPLS. And instead, you can say, you know what? We're just going to put entry points or gateways at the directly in front of our cloud-based resources or our regional data centers or our branch offices, and we're going to offload that very expensive, very slow enterprise backbone. So we've seen enterprises have very significant cost savings as they ramp down or in some cases turn off those wide area networks. Likewise, we've seen customers recover significant amounts of cost savings by retiring or moving away from hardware or network security stacks that are in the branch offices. Likewise, they're able to, because they're reducing the complexity and number of firewall rules, they're able to offload and in some cases reduce the size of those network firewalls.
Very
And
good.
make
So you
them
mentioned,
accessible
oh,
to human beings so it's not just, you start looking at firewall rules and you're like, I wonder what's connecting to this and that and the other thing. And it is a tracing mechanism that you end up doing. And with ZTNA, you actually have that trace. You don't have to wonder what is it connecting to. It's human beings can actually understand what's going on in the story.
And that's a good point, which is there are also soft dollar savings, such as reducing the volume of help desk tickets, or the example that Arlette just gave, people in the Security Operations Center who can now much more efficiently chase down incidents or anomalies, so that maybe you don't have to staff up as much.
very
And
good.
beyond, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Arlette.
Beyond just like the network questions, as you go into the ISO and ISM world or the BISO world, whatever, and people are saying, okay, I need to be able to have this system access, that system access, the other system, and I need these humans to be able to do it. We are zero trust network access, but the people who are actually able to access those pieces, it needs to be dynamic enough, and tying back to Jason's comment about, tying to your ticketing system. And then if you do have an incident, you can disconnect quickly and effectively, and then do your incident response in a way that is really much more proactive and much faster than most other ways. Because with other ways, you end up having to say, oh, wait, I need to go find that particular rule or just block everything. You can be much more surgical with a ZTNA approach to an incident response.
So Arlette,
You can
go ahead. Go ahead,
sorry,
Jason.
you can be not just more surgical, but you can be faster and you can automate some of this. And this is a real challenge. I mean, if you look at just some data from CrowdStrike, for example, they published very recently, is that just the velocity of the threat actors, where they've seen the average in terms of the dwell time once an actor gets in, that's gone down to 60 minutes, and the lowest one they've seen was 2.5 minutes. No, it was 2 minutes and 7 seconds. Excuse me. So you simply can't have enough people monitoring things to respond, in 60 minutes, let alone 2 minutes and 7 seconds. So having the ability to respond in an automated fashion and detect an anomaly and say, all right, this device is acting weirdly, we're going to require MFA and use phishing-resistant MFA. Things that you can do to really contain this are necessary in the threat landscape that we're in.
And the
Interesting.
segmentation
So
piece of it. Go ahead, Jim.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Arlette, you got something to say? Go ahead.
The segmentation piece for the user. So it's like as an end user, even as a malicious end user, you can't see the rest of your infrastructure because ZTNA blocks all that, and especially SDP blocks your visibility to any other assets. You can only see what you can see from where you are, that you are actually authorized to see. So that's also a huge differentiator, because you don't have the ability to randomly scan from the inside, and that just really secures your network in a whole different way.
So we talked a little bit about Arlette, you brought it up, the integration with a trouble ticketing system, and being very specific around AppGate. What sort of integrations are possible, and why would I want to integrate with something? What makes AppGate different when it comes to integrating with other technologies? Can you give us a rundown of that,
So I jumped to
Jason?
ServiceNow, of course, and then I'll let Jason, who's the real technical person here. But you think in terms of ServiceNow, and getting your people productive is another component of this story, which is like, how do you get people productive quickly and effectively, which is again a cost savings question, right? Okay, I have a person who's authorized to do something. I put in my ServiceNow ticket, my ServiceNow example. I'm not selling ServiceNow, so they get to do their own. There are others also, but how do you get them authorized quickly? You apply them to apply a policy to that person. Then they go in, hired on day one, authorized on day one. You don't end up having to go through a number of different kind of steps to authorize them to get the things, because you already have their roles and responsibilities identified. Jason?
One of the things that many enterprises really struggle with is having a clear picture of the who and the what, right? What we're doing, what we as security teams need to do is to be able to define and enforce policies that says who should have access to what. So in order to do that effectively, you got to know the who and you got to know the what. And in order to do that, you've got to have integrations into your identity management system, as well as deployment processes or asset management systems, CMDB, things like that. And by doing that, you get much more accuracy, you get much more velocity that ties into the speed at which your business needs to operate. And you get the ability to do things in a way that is a lot easier in offloading humans from having to integrate or make decisions or follow a manual process to tie things together. And if you think about not only the speed at which adversaries act, but the speed at which the business wants to act, you've got to automate in order to do this. And that automation requires integration. It also requires improving your business maturity around identity management, identity governance processes, as well as deployment processes for applications and workloads and data. And that's part of the, hey, we got to grow up a little bit as an industry and enforce, or maybe force, the business to do things in a little bit more mature way. And this is, it's a struggle, right? Because the business doesn't often want to do that. So as a security team, it's important to ideally get some buy-in, get executive level buy-in, so you do have the ability to push for changes, but also recognize that you got to develop the carrot, not just the stick. You got to collaborate with the business and say, hey, here's how we can help you do this thing here faster or better. And by the way, it's also more secure.
I think
So
another
again, focusing on integration, what integrations actually exist with the AppGate SDP product? What if I've got a one-off product or an old legacy product, and it contains information that I want to have access to and use that to help myself make decisions. Where do I go with some of these kinds of integrations?
So the AppGate platform has a number, and a growing number, I should say, of pre-built integrations. So these are things that tie into standards-based integration, like with your identity providers, as well as API-based integration for things like your endpoint management system, as well as the ability to interrogate workload metadata in major cloud platforms or partner platforms. So there's been a lot of work that the AppGate SDP engineering team has done to pre-build all that. And those are things that are configurable in, obviously, the administrative console. The system also has a lot of extensibility where if you have a legacy system or something custom, you can essentially write a plugin or execute a script that will pull that information in. And then the nice thing is those attributes that come in are first-class attributes. And they can be used in the policies, exactly the same as other attributes that might get pulled from an identity provider, for example.
Interesting. So I've advanced to the next slide. I'm interested enough, right? Seems like AppGate's got something that I should dig into a little bit. How would I get started with AppGate? Maybe a scenario is I hate to use the word legacy, but I'm an older fashioned kind of company. I have not yet adopted cloud. How might I think about kicking the tires on AppGate to see if it could solve some problems for me? How would I get started?
So I said there's options for that. There are ways where you can engage with us, with Jim and his team on talking through how the architecture works and defining what would a proof of concept look like in your environments. Appgate also offers self-service type of POC or evaluation for deploying an application gateway in your environment and starting to experiment with it through a free trial mechanism that we have. So some people want to dive in, hands-on, do it themselves. Other folks want to partner with the vendor and have a very interactive session where they can ask questions and together they can say, okay, here's my environment where I want to test this out. So both those things are supported. And the nice thing about what the SDP solution is, it doesn't require networking changes. It doesn't require, refactor or anything like that. It can be deployed as a network overlay, and you can experiment with that very quickly and non-disruptively in terms of other types of user access.
How does
Is,
that change if I'm actually a cloud-oriented company? I've got maybe an Azure presence or a GCP or AWS presence. Could I get started in a slightly different way there?
yeah, it would be very similar because the AppGate SDP platform is delivered as a virtual appliance and it can be deployed very easily in those environments. And that's, I would say, a significant, not even a minority, I would say a majority of the customers are using it in that environment as well as in on-prem. So it's very, very easy in a cloud environment to say, all right, I want to deploy this VM. The AppGate SDP solution is available in all the cloud marketplaces. So it could be deployed in your environment very quickly, stood up, and you can start to experiment with it. And some of the integrations we talked about are really nice because there are pre-built integrations with the metadata in those cloud environments. So it can start to immediately out of the box interrogate the metadata on your workloads and use those in the access policies.
Very interesting idea. All right, let's advance to the next topic. Let's talk about the future. What is going on in the ZTNA space? What does the future hold for the market? Where are we going with this thing?
I'll let Arlette answer that question first. She's going to get her crystal ball out.
That's right, the crystal ball. Artificial intelligence is going to drive a lot of the components of the ZTNA. In fact, we are integrating a lot of artificial intelligence into our products here, not so that they can become the decision makers, but so they can facilitate effective decision making at speed. So it really is a huge effort that's going to be driving a lot of the ZTNA. More integration, better integration, and more tightly tied to the compliance frameworks is the next pieces. They're existing pieces too. So as ZTNA gets a foothold more securely into some of the major companies and the governments across the world, they're going to mature in the space of like really tying things together. I think one of the pieces that we haven't talked about, but should, is the also direct routed. So we're not doing hairpins and like some of the like has been the case, and some of the procured infrastructure tends to drive a hairpin story. So our ZTNA does not do hairpins. You go straight through and you get a lot better performance because of that. So driving the performance questions, driving a much more intuitive interface, those are pieces in the future. But then I'm going to let Jason, who is really the futurist, talk
So
more
Arlette,
about
you mentioned
that.
AI. Jason, let's talk a little bit. How is AI going to have an impact on ZTNA in general and maybe AppGate's SDP product specifically?
So one of the biggest challenges especially in the medium to large enterprise environments is you end up with thousands of things, thousands of users, thousands of workloads. And clearly, whenever you have that large number of things, it's very difficult for a human being to make sense of it in their head. So what AI is really good at is looking that kind of at that volume of data and helping you make sense of it, classifying, organizing it, and making recommendations around that. And that's an area that is currently under development and within the AppGate platform around being able to observe actual user activity in the environment, unrestricted user activity, and then be able to say, okay, what we're seeing is these users that have these attributes in common are accessing these resources over here. You should create a policy around that so you can capture that and restrict that traffic. So looking at things like, operating system or identity group membership, role, things like that, as well as, workload attributes such as technology or location or name or IP address or things like that. And that's really going to help because it eliminates a lot of the, you know, manual work that would otherwise have to happen to do that kind of analysis around defining access policies, validating them, and um, creating and maintaining their health. So I think that's one piece of it. The other piece clearly is using AI in terms of log analysis and helping to detect anomalies and gluing together uh, things that happen across a distributed environment and making sense of them.
So
Very good.
from a
Go ahead,
security
Arlette.
perspective, from a security perspective, you end up with like a lot of false positives or false negatives, or and then distinguishing true positive from false positive, and just getting through a lot of the noise much more quickly is a huge benefit too. And that's the anomalous activity, but is it truly anomalous, or is it actually that person's regular activity, and should it be characterized that way? Those are very hard questions to answer. And even normal activity, when you look in terms of an insider threat, normal activity can still be an insider threat if it is also combined with some other things. So pulling an AI component of your log analysis and saying, okay, this will at least simplify that particular piece of it, and then pulling other components too, just makes the questions a lot easier to answer.
Excellent. Are there another thought around the future? Are there existing or emerging technologies that could potentially be used to augment ZTNA's capabilities to provide a better scenario for folks who adopt those technologies? Jason, maybe you've got some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that there's really two aspects to that. So one is the way that zero trust platforms, I would say in general, interact with other elements of the ecosystem. There are a few standards out there that we know and love, like the identity standards for authentication, SAML, OpenID Connect, et cetera. There's not a lot outside of that. And there is an emerging standard around what's called shared signals that is defining a way for different components in the system to communicate events, security events or authentication events, and essentially let different distributed components share zero trust context. That's very much an emerging standard. It's not widely adopted in commercial products yet, but I think that's going to help us in terms of enabling different elements in the ecosystem to share context, to consume context, and have a standard way, for example, for an application or a data security system to consume information about the session and make decisions based on geolocation or device risk or things like that. So that's one piece of it. The second piece is from a non-technical perspective, we're still very much early days in terms of methodologies, frameworks, and things like that. And there's a lot of, I would say, there's rapid maturity that's happening with support from the US government, for example, around the CISA zero trust maturity model and frameworks and things like that, mappings that the DoD has published. But there's still a lot of work as an industry to do to really distill that down into design patterns and repeatable methodologies. And it's an exciting area because it's still very much early days in terms of broad scale enterprise adoption of zero trust.
Okay.
And I think enterprise browser is another component of this that will complement the SDP story too, because then you have controls down to the data level. So you're not just looking at your applications, but you're also controlling your lateral movement and your full data. So you're doing the last piece, which is your internet facing component. So when you've locked down your internet, to only absolutely necessary. And then you have an enterprise browser that can also further lock that down and make sure that you have the right controls at the right place. And again, tracing those all the way through the story. I think that is another component that makes a huge difference.
Okay, that's excellent feedback. Let's wrap it up. But any closing words before we close this thing down? Any last minute comments, Jason?
I'm looking up there's a question from Alan about the standard for shared signals. So I'm looking that up. It's part of the OpenID Foundation. So
While Jason's looking that up, Arlette, have you got any closing comments you'd like to get on the table that we haven't discussed?
So I just wanted to talk about how complexity is never ending. You know, you go into the security or any store and you say, okay, well, now I want to be done. And you never ever get to the place where you're done because the next thing is happening and the next thing is happening. And you know, the pace of technology changes has been accelerating over time, the pace of infrastructure. And every time you put a new infrastructure in, you end up with a lagging infrastructure. So there's no end to the increase in complexity from that perspective. The ZTNA story really does answer a lot of those because you don't end up having to redo things over and over and over again. You have your infrastructure, you can secure it, you can lock it down, and you can start managing the complexity at a much more effective level.
Perfect. And Jason, any follow up on that question that was posted?
no, I think Arlette's covered it.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, thank you, Arlette, Jason, for jumping in and helping me with this live table talk today. I think some good information was exposed. We talked about a lot of good topics. If there's more questions that any of our participants have, please you can drop them in the Q&A for the next couple of minutes. Otherwise, reach out to one of us. It's typically first name dot last name at appgate.com for our email addresses. And if you really like some of the things that you heard today and you really want to kick the tires a little bit, there is a 30-day free trial that's offered on the appgate.com website. So you can pop out there. It is a quasi pre-deployed, quasi self-deployed scenario. So, you know, most of the technology is there, but it'll walk you through the interface will walk you through deploying some other capabilities and adding some of your own protected asset access to that solution. And as Jason mentioned, if you're a cloud customer, you can pop into any of the cloud marketplaces and find the AppGate solution there as well. There's even a short trial offered in the Amazon marketplace with some pre-built licensing capabilities. And if you enjoyed this format of learning more about AppGate and learning more about the market in general, you can join our next table talk. We're going to dig deep. You heard Arlette talk about the idea of direct routed versus cloud routed in one of her responses to my questions. Next month, October 29th, we're going to dig deep on why direct routed architecture really matters in a ZTNA solution. We'll talk about optimized network traffic, performance improvements, lack of shared anything with a direct routed model. So there's a lot of different topics to cover in that session, and it'll be an interesting one. So join us on October 29th for that. And with that, I think we'll close it out. Thank you for spending most of an hour with us. Looks like we've got to about 48 minutes past the hour. And again, thank you, Arlette and Jason. And we'll catch you on the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.